and welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series. I am Kellie de Leon with Treasure Data, and we are partnering with CDO Magazine, MIT CDOIQ, and the International Society of Chief Data Officers in a series of interviews. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Danielle Crop, Chief Data Officer at Albertsons Companies. Welcome, Danielle.
It's good to be here, Kellie. Thanks for having me.
Just kind of curious, in your role, what challenges are you facing or, addressing in terms of gathering and governing the use of customer data?
I think it's a challenge for probably every organization, right? I think our unique challenge is the different types of relationships we have with our customers, right, across our different, quote, lines of businesses, right? So, for example, most families, right? If we're working with a family in a household, right, or that they come to us as a household to shop, right? Not necessarily as an individual, right, customer, right? So we have both of those dynamics. We have households, we have customers, and then they could have different types of relationships with us. They could be an e-commerce only customer. They could be a e-commerce and in-store customer. They could be an e-commerce in-store and pharmacy customer, right? So understanding all of those different, personas, right, that we have within the organization and organizing our data accordingly at those different levels of hierarchy and understanding it is something that we're, focusing on as a platform. Right. So we are building a customer 360 for Albertsons that will help us to manage and govern all of that customer data and make it available as software to as a service to all the other organizations within the team. So so thinking about that as a central capability. And I don't think this is a new problem, right? This is something that a lot of organizations have either tackled or are tackling at this moment in time.
Mm-hmm. As regulation changes and channels change and the type of data we're gathering continues to evolve, I think it will, remain a challenge that will continue to evolve and continue to need to be addressed over time for sure. With so much opportunity, and as you said, you're, relatively new in your role and your role is new to the organization. We talked a little bit earlier just about kind of prioritizing and doing those stakeholder interviews throughout the organization. How do you help really prioritize? How is, an enterprise like Albertsons going to maximize getting the value from customer data? I'm sure there's always 100 new ideas on the list that you could be working on, or 200 or 1,000. How do you really, in your role, help drive the focus on getting the maximum value from customer data and prioritizing what you're working on?
I encourage my team to, when they're doing stakeholder interviews, like any product management function, right? You do the stakeholder interviews, you gather the feedback, you gather the opportunities that there are, and then you evaluate them based on, kind of a return on investment based approach. And you look at it and say, and you just, not an extensive one, but kind of a quick one to say, hey, here's what we think the opportunity is here. And then you go after the ones with the largest opportunity, first. I always like using data to prioritize data, right?
Seems like a good plan.
So that's like the number one thing. And of course, there's other priorities that have to come in, like compliance and strategic, big strategic opportunities for the organization that may not be easy to size from an ROI perspective. But I think that if you use all of those principles kind of together to make decisions, you'll make better decisions on what work you're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In your role, and thinking about how you're using data and analytics to drive value in the organization, do you have a vision for how data and analytics can play a role in innovation within your company or within your industry?
I mean, I think it's very difficult to innovate without data. That's just my own personal opinion. I'm sure there's others, but as a chief data officer, I'm of course biased towards data. But I just think it's very in this moment in time, and increasingly throughout history. I mean, as we move forward, with more ML AI capabilities, data is going to be absolutely at the center of innovation. And I think that if you don't have that data governed and managed properly, as we discussed earlier, then you're going to make big mistakes. I mean, we've seen some of those things happen with AI bias, right? And a lot of the AI bias has come from the fact that the data they were using to train with was not well understood. Right. And so therefore, when they trained it automatically to be biased without even knowing it.
Right.
So I think that, those types of, so to me, it's like this continual evolution of the CDO role, and making sure that you have, data management, data governance, data products, and data science, in my opinion, in one organization is going to become, I think, more critical as we move forward. And then, of course, working very closely with privacy, legal, CISO, et cetera, to make sure that your data is secure and managed and private and all those things. I see a continual focus on that as we move forward. In order to be innovative, you're going to have governed data. It's going to be like they're going to have to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Speaking of things that go hand in hand, I think the other thing that you touched on that definitely goes hand in hand with data is technology. Whether it's, we were talking about where the technology limits in terms of, where we're at in terms of Wi-Fi and 5G and all of those kinds of things, to even thinking about internally the tech stack that folks might have access to, that they have access, front end office users have access to data, all of those things play in. So technology and data certainly go hand in hand. I'm curious, where do you see sort of technology helping to advance what you can achieve with data and analytics to, influence CX or to influence the value drivers for your business? How does technology play into what you're doing?
I mean, it's the source of much of the data, right? And then in addition to it being the source and the way that we consume and manage and all, I mean, it's just so entwined, right? But I think that as far as like kind of what the next generation, right? I think the problems that we're facing are the problems we've kind of faced and continue to evolve from the big data revolution. Right, which is, and it goes back to kind of what I said earlier about big tech, right? Like you have so much data, it's almost impossible to know it all. But if you don't know it all, then you can't manage it, govern it, or innovate out on it appropriately. So it's an interesting push and pull we have in that space. And I think that some of the challenges future technology is trying to solve within this space is using AI and ML to know what your data is. So it's an interesting, like trying to use data once again to define data. And I think that will help us to contain like, okay, well, what data do we really need to know in order to be able to define the rest of the data? So we can be a little bit more honed in on the problem. And then using that, so I think there's a lot of different companies in the space of trying to understand how we categorize and catalog and manage data, right? And I think that that's going to continue to be a challenge of how do you automate understanding your data because of the big data environment. So I think that's going to continue to be a focus in the landscape as we move forward. It is certainly not an easy problem to solve.
And circling back to one last thing from something we talked about earlier, you talked about, kind of maybe in your situation, you had less legacy systems to overcome just because of where the industry was overall and kind of what's going on with transformation. As you're thinking about your goals and where you're heading, what role do you play or should a CDO play in sort of defining the technology roadmap that's going to be required to support, the internal operations folks and how they need to use data, the CX, things that you want to achieve that are in customer facing ways? What role do you play as the CDO in kind of defining that technology roadmap?
Well, as the, chief data product officer, right? The role is to, work with work with the business, right? And the stakeholders to define what priorities we need to run the business, translate that, and pass and work collaboratively with the technologies partners to deliver on what we need for the future. Mm-hmm. And that's the role, right? That's the role of a product manager in general. And that's where I see the CDO function being in that role to be the translator between the business needs this, and that means our tech stack probably needs to be this. What do you think, technologies? What do you think, architecture team? How do we get to, really omni-channel? How are we going to get there, right? Because we've talked about omni-channel for 15 years now, right? But it's still not really omni-channel, and it's certainly not omni-channel real time, right? Yet. Yeah. And so I think that, being in there to help them understand, here's the business use cases. And here's, as the data team, how we translate those into data user stories, right? And then tech team, how do you then take that and turn that into technical reality? I think is how it works together. That's how I see it.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I have so enjoyed talking with you and hearing your perspective and all of the exciting things that you're doing to drive customer experience and obviously, influence the value that customers get out of their interactions with Albertsons Companies, but also how you're driving that data value and business value within the organization as well. It's been really interesting to gain your perspective. So thank you, Danielle, for joining me.
You're welcome, Kelly. It's been a pleasure.
Please visit cdomagazine.tech for additional interviews.